my background is not classical Chinese art or Chinese language training, but I was very interested in the way globalization would affect contemporary art. And China was at the center of globalization. So I was particularly interested how Chinese artists would respond to all the rapid changes taking place in China, the open door policy, the influx of Western influences. It seemed to me that they were at the center of something, and I really wanted to know more about what they thought about those changes. The first time I visited China was in 2004. I went for the Shanghai Biennial of that year, and I spent about 2-3 weeks in China at that time. You have to understand that at that time when I got to China, there were 3 galleries for me to visit. That's it, 3. But I could see that something big was about to erupt. And just for you to understand the contrast, there's about 300 galleries now in Beijing. So I knew that something big was going to happen. The energy of the artists and the potential that I saw at that biennial, I could tell that this place had a huge amount of potential, and I was very excited to go back and visit again. At the very beginning, before there were galleries or museums, a lot of the support came from Western collectors who were living in China, like diplomats and journalists and art historians who were living in China. They gave a lot of support to the Chinese artists when nobody else was giving it. But since 2000, there's been tremendous amount of support from the domestic scene in China. You know, China right now has the second largest art market in the world. It's almost as big as the United States art market. It has everything to do with that China has emerged as a major superpower, and superpowers want to have culture. It's very important for a country to be able to say that in addition to economic development, they have creative development and that they're a creative country. And so there has been a lot of support given to this development, not by Western collectors, but by Chinese collectors. They are the force behind all the new museums that are developing. They are what's supporting the gallery structure. And all of these changes have taken place, of course, because China has changed so much also. For me, one of the biggest differences I see is that the older generation of artists felt that it was very important to express their Chinese-ness in their art. You could tell that their art was made by a Chinese artist from a mile away. And often their artworks had references to Mao, to the Cultural Revolution, to Ming Dynasty furniture, to all of these aspects of Chinese culture. The younger generation is far more global. First of all, a lot of them are not that interested in exploring the issue of identity. There are many other issues you can explore in art than the issue of identity. And the younger generation feels liberated to explore things like abstract art or social issues or environmental issues or gender differences. They don't necessarily think that they need to explore their own identity in their artwork as much at all. But also I find that a lot of the younger generation, for them, globalism is their identity. They grew up with the opening of KFC in Beijing, or the ubiquitous Starbucks all over the place, or the iPhone. So their identity is rooted in globalization. That is why they're much more global artists. I think that Americans were not aware of Chinese contemporary art till the late 1990s. So that was their first exposure to it in a big way, when these artists were living in the States and this show Inside Out took place. And at the time, Chinese contemporary art was very hot as a phenomena. Like, people were all very, very interested in getting art from China that looked Chinese and that expressed things about the Chinese political situation. Today, I think people are not so much looking for Chinese contemporary art, but they are very aware of a growing number of artists who are coming from China. They don't see them as Chinese contemporary artists, or they don't see Chinese contemporary art as a trend, but they're willing to look at these artists as individuals who are making creative contributions. And I think that that's a positive step forward. So that Chinese artists are no longer pigeonholed in a category based on national boundaries. They are able to transcend those boundaries and being able to see for what they can do on their own as individuals. Everybody is very positive and upbeat in China about the direction of Chinese contemporary art. I think that what we're seeing happening in China is that the situation is getting increasingly professionalized and the standards are going up and the artists are responding by making better and better work. Below that, many people were talking about nervousness about the art market there and whether the art market is going to continue to grow. It seems like it's shrinking a bit and things are slowing down a bit, and that will have a dampering effect on the artists. So we'll have to see over the next year what's going to happen. I think art is an enormously effective vehicle for promoting understanding between two countries. I think a lot more has to be done in the United States about bringing Chinese contemporary art to the United States. I think U.S. museums are lagging behind the times, and that there's a ton of Chinese artists that haven't been shown here yet that should be shown here. But also what I'm seeing happening in China is that Chinese museums are showing Western artists increasingly. So when I talk to young people in China, they are much more familiar with American artists than they were before. Even 5 years ago, I think they were less familiar. But now, when I was in Shanghai recently, all the museums had major shows of Western artists. You went from museum to museum, and you got to see quite great exhibitions of works by Louise Bourgeois, or Francis Alise, or Thomas Hirshhorn. And I think that by both countries making an effort to understand each other's cultures, that will help us with our differences on other issues.